In this lesson, we'll learn to use basic RSpec syntax. Why test? What is the value of testing? We want to make sure the application behaves the way that the customer user wants and expects. We also want to ensure that the user is able to interact with the application without any errors or unexpected behavior. Tests also help us to convey the purpose of the code clearly and often act as documentation. By looking at the acceptance tests, a developer can easily understand how the application should work. Ruby has several testing frameworks. One of the most popular among Rails developers is RSpec, a behavior-driven development style test framework. It focuses on writing specifications of how an application should behave. Let's begin by running Rails new testing, which will generate a new Rails project. Then we'll add RSpec Rails as a gem to the development and test group of our gem file, and then we'll run bundle install. We then need to install RSpec by running bundle exec Rails generate RSpec :install, which will generate the RSpec files and directories. Open the spec/spechelper.rb file. This file contains the RSpec configuration. There's also another file at spec/railshelper.rb, which has Rails-specific config for RSpec. We can configure RSpec by uncommenting the large comment block in spec/spechelper.rb. To uncomment the block, delete the line that starts with =begin and the line that starts with =end. This will activate all of the config that was commented out by default. We'll stick with the defaults here, but this section provides a lot of different options to configure RSpec's functionality. Different applications and teams will have configured RSpec differently, and even added additional gems that modify RSpec's behavior. RSpec has a lot of capabilities, but because it has the potential to feel like a completely new language to learn, we'll focus on a few specific aspects of RSpec's syntax. A spec in RSpec relies on setting an expectation. Look at the following example. We are setting the expectation that 2 + 2 will equal 4. The expect method takes an argument that we're going to set an expectation on. We call .to on the resulting expectation and we pass it a matcher. The result is evaluated to see if the expectation was a match to the matcher. Let's look at this again in a more verbose way. You would not see this written in this style in a production app, but it should help clarify what's going on here. So we set up some behavior, 2 + 2, to make an expectation on the result of that behavior. In this case, we're using the EQ matcher, but there are many more matchers like be, contain exactly, include. In order to actually run expectations, you must wrap them in a complete spec. You do this using the it method, which accepts an optional string and a block containing your expectations. The above examples wouldn't properly run without an it wrapping them. Now we have a complete spec. The string is optional, and some developers prefer to keep their specs minimal like below. Generally, these bare specs depend on describe and context blocks to explain the goals of the testing. These blocks allow you to organize and group specs together. Typically, you will use describe to specify something concrete, like a method or a class that you are testing, while context will specify a condition or a concept. In this code, we are nesting context within a describe block that specifies the method we're testing. These can be nested in any order and as many times as you want, depending on the organization you want in your spec file. The outermost block must be a describe block for the overall target of the test. In this case, the voter object. A lot of specs require setup in order to perform a task that actually have expectations placed on it. Often this setup can be reused or is complex enough that it can detract from the actual spec we're trying to write. In these cases, it can be helpful to extract the setup using let or before. In RSpec, let allows you to define a variable that can be used and will be memoized or cached once it is used in a spec. So if we have a complex object to set up and we want to interact with that object inside a spec, we can set it up like this. When we reference cart in the specs, it goes up the chain of context blocks. It, describe, context, looking for something to satisfy that name. The same as would happen in a normal variable or method lookup. The code inside of the let block will only run if the spec needs to use it. Otherwise it won't, and this can be a great way to share setup between specs without bogging down every spec that doesn't need it. Before blocks have a similar purpose, but they will run before every spec they apply to. Here we are using the before block to add all of the items to the cart before testing item count with multiple items. We don't have to repeat the setup of shopping cart and can reuse the setup across more specs that require empty and full carts. Now, you will need to use expect, to, and EQ in the code below to test that 2 plus 2 does indeed equal 4. Then, use describe, context, it, expect, to, and be to modify the code below in order to test that 1, a voter that is younger than age 18 is not allowed to vote, and 2, that a voter that is age 18 or older is allowed to vote. Next, modify the code block by using let to set up a new shopping cart that belongs to the user Jane Doe. Then use let to set up an items array that contains 3 items, each with a name and price cents property.